Religion and global governance are two concerns that now provoke new debates. Recent events, when tragedies happen under the label of religion, show both how people are linked together by instant communication and transnational structures, and how the appeal of to religious belief can be manipulated for destructive interests. Some observers see this situation as a change in history. For example, the French writer and painter Marek Alter remarks in an interview, "La mutation que je constate comme observateur engagé n'est pas l'irruption de la barbarie dans nos vies quotidiennes, mais l'irruption de Dieu. Dieu est de retour, et cela complique tout. Aujourd'hui, il faut oser parler de Dieu. Le silence, dicté par une fausse conception de la laïcité, est le pire des remèdes." Thus, to speak of interaction of religion and global governance may be really timely. Global governance is, first of all, an aspiration. The idea is not new. The management of the human family and its diversity of cultures and customs has been at the root of ancient empires, of Charlemagne, of the Society of Nations, of the present United Nations. In response to major disasters and social disruption, attempts have been made to develop a global governance so that tragedies could be prevented or made more tolerable by a comprehensive and common solidarity. Today, global governance consists of a constellation of actors that work within a global normative framework and exercise their influence on the global level. These actors or players could be classified in three categories: governments and intergovernmental organizations, civil society, NGO, experts, movements, lobbyists, and business, namely the Global Compact and the national and transnational corporations that follow the norms of global governance. There is no world supergovernment, but a fluid authority that flows from resolutions, informal agreement, conclusion of UN conferences, and the experts that produce policy papers which converge in some basic common attitude and concerns. The impression that I have is that the international system has arrived at a conclusion of a cycle begun at the end of World War II, drastically affected by the 1968 Cultural Revolution and somewhat exhausted in its capacity to decide. The result of this journey is twofold. An obvious success was obtained in changing public culture, social norms, policies relating to personal freedom and identity, and then a failure appears to be evident in the inability to reform international institutions or to create new ones and to arrive at making binding decisions. The success and failure may be more deeply related than it seems on the surface. Could it be that the ideology of extreme individualism has paralyzed common action? That a problem exists with global governance seems evident from multiple sites where war rages or violent conflicts continue to explode. Syria, Iraq, Palestine, Ukraine, Central African Republic, Nigeria. Evidence is given also by the negotiations that have no or minimal positive conclusions: nuclear non-proliferation, environment and climate, the Conference on Disarmament, the functioning of the Security Council, of trade deals. Complications arise from the fact that in many cases non-state actors are involved and that these crises are all simultaneous. Some analysts raise the question, is religion a variable that further complicates the current situation? An appeal to religion could add an extremely emotional charge and contribute to the demonization of the opponent and thus prevent dialogue as the way to bridge communities and dissipate prejudice. In the official document, the pillars on which rests the search for solutions to the world's problems, of which the international institutions are mandated to take responsibility, are peace, security, development, and human rights. In the international architecture, these pillars are not isolated, but instead are mutually supportive. For example, the Sustainable Development Goals for the period 2015-2030, still in draft form, show a close relationship between the fight against poverty and hunger and peace, and between respect for human rights and security. Confronted with so many problems, experts and technocrats ask themselves how they can devise concrete solutions and how they can arrive at a positive result. The why of their efforts usually is not placed on the table. It will be too complex and difficult. Yet it seems clear that violence and injustices persist and have not found a practical solution. I believe we should reflect on the culture that supports the policies of international specialized organizations, of their experts and high-level managers, to understand if there is compatibility between global governance and religion. This path would take us to analyze the philosophical base implicit in the present efforts at a global governance and articulate the points of contact and divergence with the beliefs of the major religions. I will limit myself, however, to a more modest task: to sketch the view of global governance and the social doctrine of the Catholic tradition. The Catholic Church is a companion on the journey towards an authentic international community. Concern for an ordered and peaceful coexistence within the human family prompts the Church to insist on the need to establish some universal public authority, acknowledged as such by all and endowed with effective power to safeguard on behalf of all security, regard for justice, and respect for rights. It is essential that such an authority arise from mutual agreement and that it is not to be imposed, nor must it be understood as a kind of global superstate. Global order rests on some fundamental points. Today's world is marked by international interdependence. The human community is global, and therefore moral obligations extend beyond national boundaries. Justice applies within as well as beyond national borders. And finally, the pursuit of the common good is that of global society. Consequently, political authority, which is necessary for the realization of the common good, must be global in some way and to some extent. Already in 1963, Pope John XXIII wrote, "Today, the universal common good presents us with problems which are worldwide in their dimensions, problems, therefore, which cannot be solved except by a public authority with power, organization, and means coextensive with these problems, and with a worldwide sphere of activity. Consequently, the moral order itself demands the establishment of some such general form of public authority. The question remains open on how much a transfer of political authority should take place from nation-states to supranational institutions. In particular, Pope John Paul II, nations transmit and protect culture, and cultures facilitate and should maintain the search for truth and for God. Solidarity, on the other hand, will lead the states to use existing international organizations to promote the global common good. And Pope Benedict XV called for a true world political authority. This authority would manage the global economy, bring about integral development, disarmament, food security, and peace, guarantee the protection of the environment, and regulate migration. It should have sufficient power to ensure compliance with its decision by all parties. This authority remains a means toward attaining morally required ends. Development will never be fully guaranteed through automatic or impersonal forces, whether they derive from the market or from international politics. Development is impossible without upright men and women, without financiers and politicians whose consciences are finely attuned to the requirements of the common good. Both professional competence and moral consistency are necessary. When technology is allowed to take over, the result is confusion between ends and means, such that the sole criterion for action in business is thought to be the maximization of profit, in politics, the consolidation of power, and in science, the findings of research. Fraternity is the indispensable condition for the proper functioning of institutions. The constellation of actors engaged in global governance already is making important contributions in preventing conflicts and promoting conflict resolutions and humanitarian law, and refining the responsibility to protect, but must become more effective. The insights of religions and the primacy of the human person and the inalienable dignity of each person and on the requirements of solidarity or fraternity can serve as needed resources for the proper functioning of global governance. The UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights have embodied these principles and values, and the challenge is their implementation in their respective spheres of activity. It is also true that human communities are served by a structured dialogue between both the Church and the international organization, and undertake to serve the good of the same common subject, the human person. The common efforts of the Church and civil authorities can find expression in the stipulation of mutual agreements. Religion does not lead to global clashes of civilizations, but contributes to the resolution of conflicts and the promotion of human flourishing. A very recent example is the mediation of Pope Francis and the reestablishment of dialogue between Cuba and the United States. The social doctrine of the Church encourages the institutionalization of the international society as the way to build an authentic universal community of peoples living together in peace. In this context, international organizations should pay special attention to the vulnerable groups of society and the poorest countries in order to reduce the inequality gap. At the same time, the Church calls for reform of the international structures that do not respond to the real needs of the people. In order to accomplish this goal, the Church proposes that such organization be structured according to humanistic and moral principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and participation in view of the integral development of every person and of every human community. Moreover, the Church recognizes that the interdependence among men and nations takes on a moral dimension and is the determining factor for relations in the modern world in the economic, cultural, political, and religious sense. In this context, it is hoped that international organization will be revised through a process that presupposes the overcoming of political rivalries and the renouncing of all desire to manipulate these organizations, which exist solely for the common good, in order to achieve a greater degree of international order. And I am trying to conclude. A final observation on compatibility between claims grounded in religious exclusivism and practices oriented toward political pluralism. Migrations and information technology have brought about a physical and cultural pluralism in practically every society, and global governance must take into account this new reality and find a way to manage it as gift rather than a problem. Monotheistic religions claim more than 3 billion adherents. A critical question is whether monotheism, by its very nature, is politically exclusive. Belief in one God, who commands love of one's neighbor, is a sufficient foundation for three principles that undergird a project of political pluralism: the separation of identity between religious community and the state, openness to religious reason and persuasion in the public sphere, and the impartiality of the state toward all religions. Thus, even in a time of violence, terrorism, war, and fear, faith traditions can motivate and mobilize careful reflection, peacemaking, and the politics of hope and love. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.